In the spring of 1994, the city of Regensburg was still characterized by a mixture of Bavarian tradition and a cautious awakening to a new era. German reunification was only a few years in the past, and medieval architecture mingled with the first signs of a modern society in the streets of the old town. This was where Sabine Hoffmann lived, a 52-year-old woman who had been dealt a harsh blow by fate. Her husband Thomas had been killed in a car accident in the fall of 1993. A drunk driver had rammed into him on the highway, and Sabine had become a widow from one day to the next. Thomas had been an architect, a successful man with visions and plans. Together, they had built a beautiful life, bought a terraced house on the outskirts of Regensburg, and raised their only son, Stefan. After her husband's death, Sabine's world fell apart. She spent the first few months after the accident in a kind of fog. She functioned mechanically, doing the most necessary things, but inside, she was empty. Friends and neighbors tried to support her, but no one could fill the void Thomas had left behind. Sabine had worked as an elementary school teacher, but after the accident she took 6 months of sick leave. She couldn't bear the thought of standing in front of a class full of children and pretending that everything was fine. Stefan Hoffmann was 27 years old at the time. He had studied business administration and worked for a medium-sized management consultancy in Munich. He had always been close to his parents, especially his mother. As an only child, Stefan had received a lot of attention, and his mother had always cared for him lovingly. After his father's death, Stefan initially returned to Regensburg every weekend to check on his mother. He was very worried about her. Sabine had lost a lot of weight, seemed absent-minded, and spent most of her time alone in the house. The rooms that had once been full of life now felt cold and empty. Thomas's study remained untouched, as if he might come back at any moment. His jacket still hung on the coat rack, his slippers stood neatly next to the sofa. Sabine couldn't bring herself to part with these things. She clung to every memento as if it were a lifeline in a sea of grief. In the summer of 1994, Sabine's condition continued to deteriorate. She began taking sleeping pills because she was plagued by nightmares. Again and again she saw the moment of the accident before her eyes, even though she hadn't been there. Her doctor, Dr. Albrecht, prescribed antidepressants and recommended therapy, but Sabine refused. In her generation, people didn't talk about mental health issues. You gritted your teeth and carried on. But Sabine couldn't carry on. She quit her job as a teacher and withdrew completely. The neighbors, especially Mrs. Baumann next door, noticed the change. The house looked neglected, the garden was overgrown, and Sabine was hardly ever seen. Mrs. Baumann spoke to Stefan several times when he came over on weekends and expressed her concern. Stefan knew that things couldn't go on like this. In September of that year, Stefan made a decision that would change his life and his mother's forever. He quit his job in Munich and moved back to Regensburg. Officially, he said he wanted to be there for his mother during this difficult time. He found a job at a smaller company in Regensburg. The position paid less and didn't offer the same career opportunities, but Stefan didn't care. His mother needed him, and he couldn't abandon her. When he moved back into his parents' house, into his old childhood bedroom, which still had posters of soccer players and rock bands on the walls, it felt strange. He was 27, a grown man, and he was returning to the world of his youth. But the atmosphere in the house was completely different. It was no longer the lively home of his childhood, but a quiet place full of grief and memories. The first few weeks after Stefan's return were difficult. Sabine hardly seemed to notice his presence. She spent most of her time in her bedroom, which she had hardly left since Thomas's death. Stefan took over the housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, and trying to restore some semblance of normality. In the evenings, he sat down next to his mother's bed and talked to her, telling her about his work, sharing memories of his father, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Sabine responded, sometimes she just stared into space. But slowly, something began to change. Sabine started to respond to S0n again. She asked questions, smiled occasionally, and began to leave her bed again. In October, they ate together at the dining table for the first time in months. Sabine had gotten dressed, combed her hair, and even put on a little makeup. S0n was overwhelmed by this small step forward. He took his mother's hand and told her how proud he was of her. Sabine began to cry, but these were not the desperate tears of the past months, but tears of relief. In the weeks that followed, Sabine's condition improved steadily. She began to take care of the household again, went shopping, and took short walks around the neighborhood. S0n and she developed a new routine. In the mornings, they had breakfast together before S0n left for work. In the evenings, they cooked together and then often sat in the kitchen for a long time, drinking tea and talking. These conversations became increasingly intimate. Sabine began to share things she had never confided in anyone before. She spoke about her fears, her loneliness, her feelings of guilt. She confessed to S0n that she sometimes wondered if she could have prevented the accident. That evening, she had asked Thomas to run an errand in town. If he hadn't driven, he would still be alive. S0n listened, comforted her, and assured her that she was not to blame. But in these intimate moments, something shifted between them. The boundary between mother and son began to blur. S0n was not aware of this at first. For him, it was natural to be close to his mother, to support and comfort her. But Sabine developed a dependence on this closeness. S0n was the only light in her dark world. When he wasn't there, she felt lost. She began to miss him when he was at work, longing for the evenings when they could be together again. At first, these feelings were unclear to her. She interpreted them as normal maternal love and gratitude, but it was more than that. In November, the physical boundaries began to shift. Sabine had nightmares and called out for S0n at night. He came into her room, sat down on her bed, and held her hand until she fell asleep again. One night, she asked him to stay with her. S0n hesitated, but when he saw the desperate plea in her eyes, he gave in. He lay down next to her, on top of the blanket, and held her in his arms until she fell asleep. It felt strange, yet comforting. Sabine felt safe in his arms, protected, and S0n felt needed. This became a habit. Almost every night, Sabine called for S0n and he came. They slept next to each other, and although nothing inappropriate happened, the intimacy of the situation was obvious. S0n began to feel uncomfortable. He knew this wasn't normal, that a grown man shouldn't be sleeping with his mother every night. But when he tried to distance himself, Sabine burst into tears, and he gave in. He felt caught between his desire to help her and his discomfort with the situation. In December, shortly before Christmas, something happened that changed the dynamic for good. Sabine had decided to return to work. She had had a conversation with her former school, and they had offered her a part-time position. S0n was thrilled and wanted to celebrate. He bought a bottle of sparkling wine, and they toasted together. They drank more than usual, and the mood became exuberant. Sabine laughed properly for the first time in months, and S0n was happy to see her like this. They sat on the sofa, close together, and Sabine rested her head on S0n's shoulder. She talked about Thomas, about the good times, and suddenly she started to cry. S0n took her in his arms and stroked her hair. Sabine lifted her head and looked at him. Their faces were only inches apart, and in that moment something happened that neither of them could explain later. Sabine kissed S0n. It wasn't a motherly kiss on the cheek, but a kiss on the lips. S0n froze. His first instinct was to pull away, but he couldn't. The combination of alcohol, emotional confusion, and months of intimacy paralyzed him. Sabine recoiled in shock and stammered an apology. She got up, ran to her room and closed the door. Stefan remained sitting on the sofa, unable to process what had just happened. The following days were marked by unbearable tension. Sabine and Stefan avoided looking at each other, hardly spoke to each other, and the atmosphere in the house was icy. Stefan considered moving out, but he knew that this would plunge his mother back into depression. Sabine was deeply ashamed of what she had done. She couldn't believe she had kissed her own son. She tried to dismiss it as a moment of weakness, a result of alcohol and emotional overwhelm. But the truth was that in that moment she had felt something she shouldn't have felt. The week before Christmas passed in this tense silence. Stefan worked longer than necessary to spend less time at home. Sabine tried to distract herself by decorating the house and baking Christmas cookies, things she hadn't done since Thomas's death. Christmas Eve was approaching, and they both knew they couldn't spend that day in silence. On the morning of December 24th, they finally spoke to each other. Sabine apologized sincerely and explained that she had been confused, that she should never have put Stefan in such a situation. Stefan accepted the apology and suggested making a fresh start. They agreed to set clear boundaries. Stefan would sleep in his own room again, and they would return their relationship to a normal mother-son dynamic. But promises are easier made than kept. On New Year's Eve, as they toasted the new year together, it happened again. This time it was Stefan who made the first move. He had drunk too much and was emotionally distraught. The year 1994 had been the hardest of his life, and he longed for comfort. Sabine initially tried to reject him, but she too was weak. The loneliness, the longing for closeness, and the months of emotional entanglement were too strong. That night, they crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The next morning, they both woke up with an overwhelming feeling of shame and horror. They couldn't look at each other and didn't talk about what had happened. Stefan left the house for several days and stayed with a friend. He needed distance to think. Sabine was left alone and fell into a state of despair. She had not only lost her husband, but now also her integrity and the innocence of her relationship with her son. When Stefan returned after 3 days, they had both made a decision. They would pretend that nothing had happened. They would forget this incident and move on. But as it turned out, some things could not simply be forgotten. The shadows of those nights would haunt them and ultimately lead to a catastrophe that no one could have foreseen. The first months of 1995 passed in a state of tense normality. Stefan and Sabine desperately tried to return to a healthy mother-son relationship, but the events of New Year's Eve had changed something irrevocably. Stefan decided to spend more time outside the house. He started meeting up with old school friends more often, joined the local sports club, and tried to build a social life of his own. Sabine had started her part-time job at the elementary school, and working with the children helped distract her. Her colleagues noticed that she had become quiet and reserved, very different from the lively teacher she had been before her husband's death. But no one asked any questions. Everyone knew about her loss and respected her grief. Despite their efforts to keep their distance, Stefan and Sabine repeatedly found themselves in situations that were dangerously close to the line of what was appropriate. An accidental touch in the kitchen, eye contact that lasted too long, a hug that became a little too intimate. Both felt the tension, but neither spoke of it. In March, it happened again. Stefan had had a stressful week at work and came home late in the evening, exhausted. Sabine was still awake and had been waiting for him. They had a glass of wine together and talked about trivial things. But when Stefan wanted to get up to go to bed, Sabine held his hand. She looked at him with a gaze that expressed both despair and desire. Stefan should have left, he knew that, but he stayed. That night, all barriers finally fell. What had been a one-time alcohol-induced mistake on New Year's Eve now developed into a regular, albeit secret, relationship. They met at night in Sabine's room when the world was asleep and no one could see them. During the day, they behaved normally, almost exaggeratedly polite to each other, as if they could block out the reality of the night. S0n was torn inside. Part of him knew that this was wrong, that he was crossing a moral and social boundary that should never have been crossed. But another part of him longed for this intimacy. His mother was the only woman in his life who loved him unconditionally, who needed him, and in a perverse way that gave him a sense of importance. Sabine experienced a similar inner conflict. She was ashamed of what she was doing, but at the same time, she felt more alive than she had in years. S0n filled the void that Thomas had left behind, and although she knew this was not a healthy solution, she couldn't stop. She justified her actions to herself with loneliness, loss, and despair. In May, the neighbors began to notice changes. Mrs. Baumann told her friend that Sabine seemed to have blossomed again, almost youthful. S0n, on the other hand, seemed tense and absent. At work, he made mistakes, forgot appointments, and often seemed distracted. His supervisor spoke to him about it, but S0n assured him that everything was fine. In June, Sabine realized that her period had not come. At first, she blamed it on menopause. After all, she was 52 years old. But when she still hadn't started bleeding in July and began feeling nauseous in the mornings, she began to suspect what had happened. She secretly bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy on the other side of town, where no one knew her. The result was positive. Sabine sat on the bathroom floor and stared at the test in disbelief. This couldn't be. She was too old to get pregnant, wasn't she? But her body proved otherwise. She was pregnant by her own son. Sabine spent 3 days hiding the truth from S0n. She could hardly eat, didn't sleep, and felt as if she was slowly breaking down from the inside. How could she tell him she was pregnant? How could she put this unbelievable reality into words? On the 4th day, a Friday evening at the end of June, she broke down. S0n found her crying in the kitchen, the pregnancy test in her trembling hand. He understood immediately. His face turned ashen, and he had to hold on to the table. The words he stammered were barely intelligible. "That's not possible. You can't." Sabine just nodded and continued crying. They spent the next few hours in a state of shock. S0n paced back and forth in the living room, unable to think clearly. Sabine sat huddled on the sofa, staring into space. Finally, they sat down together and tried to talk rationally about the situation. S0n asked if Sabine was sure the test was correct. She nodded. He asked if there was any possibility that the child could be someone else's. Sabine looked at him with a blank stare. Since Thomas's death, there had been no other man in her life, only S0n. The truth was inescapable. S0n suggested going to a doctor, but not in Regensburg. They drove to Munich, where no one knew them. At an anonymous clinic, a gynecologist confirmed the pregnancy. Sabine was 8 weeks along. The doctor, Dr. Schreiber, a man in his 50s with a matter-of-fact demeanor, explained the options. For a woman of Sabine's age, pregnancy carried increased risks. He recommended further tests and cautiously raised the possibility of termination. In Germany, abortion was possible up to the 12th week after consultation. Sabine listened, but she couldn't make a decision. Everything felt unreal. On the drive back to Regensburg, they hardly spoke. S0n drove mechanically, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Sabine stared out the window at the passing landscape. When they got home, they sat down at the kitchen table and tried again to find a solution. S0n was in favor of an abortion. He argued that a child should not be born under these circumstances. The genetic risks were too high and social disaster was inevitable. Sabine wavered. Part of her wanted to make the problem go away, but another part resisted the idea of ending the life inside her. She had already raised a child, S0n, and despite everything that had happened, she loved him more than anything. The counseling center they had to visit in Munich was a dreary room in an office building. A social worker, Miss Kerner, conducted the mandatory interview. She asked standard questions about Sabine's life situation, her reasons for a possible termination, and her emotional state. Sabine lied. She said she was single, that the pregnancy was the result of a brief affair, and that she did not feel able to raise another child at her age. Miss Kerner nodded sympathetically and handed her the counseling certificate. Sabine now had 3 days to think it over before the procedure could be performed. But something unexpected happened during those 3 days. Sabine began to feel a connection to the life inside her. She would lay her hand on her belly at night and imagine what the child would look like. Would it have Stefan's eyes, her nose? At the same time, terrible thoughts plagued her. What if the child was born sick? What if it had deformities, as was often the case with inbreeding? She had read enough to know that the risks were real. The day before the scheduled procedure, Sabine told Stefan that she couldn't do it. She would keep the child. Stefan was horrified. He begged her to be reasonable, but Sabine stuck to her decision. The pregnancy progressed, and with each passing day, her fear grew. Sabine began to have further tests done, always in Munich, always under false pretenses. She told the doctors that the child's father was unknown or unavailable. In the 3rd month, an initial ultrasound scan was performed. The doctor frowned as he looked at the images. He said there were abnormalities that needed to be monitored further. Sabine's heart sank. In the 4th month of pregnancy, Sabine was referred to the University Hospital in Munich for detailed diagnostics. Dr. Schreiber had insisted on this after the previous ultrasound images had shown irregularities. In a sterile examination room, a specialist in prenatal diagnostics, Dr. Lehmann carried out a detailed examination. She slowly moved the transducer over Sabine's belly and studied the monitor intently. Her expression became increasingly serious. After almost an hour, she asked Sabine to get dressed and come to her office. Dr. Lehmann was a woman in her early 40s, with short dark hair and a direct manner. She placed her hands on the desk and chose her words carefully. There were clear indications of developmental disorders in the fetus. The heart showed structural abnormalities, a condition known as tetralogy of Fallot, a complex congenital heart defect. In addition, abnormalities were visible in the facial skull, possibly a cleft lip and palate. Further examinations were necessary, but the prognosis was serious. She strongly recommended genetic counseling. Then she asked the question Sabine feared most. Is there a possibility that the child's parents are blood relatives? Sabine froze. Her mouth went dry and she couldn't speak. Dr. Lehmann watched her closely. I have to ask this question because the type of malformations we see are often associated with consanguineous relationships. Are you related to the child's father? Sabine shook her head mechanically and muttered that this was not the case, but her voice sounded hollow and uncertain. Dr. Lehmann made a note in the file and said she would recommend amniocentesis to rule out or confirm genetic abnormalities. In the weeks that followed, Sabine's mental state deteriorated dramatically. She could hardly sleep and suffered from massive feelings of guilt. Stefan tried to support her, but he too was at the end of his tether. He made so many mistakes at work that his boss called him in for another meeting. This time, the tone was much harsher. He was expected to pull himself together, otherwise his future at the company would have to be reconsidered. Stefan just nodded and left the office silently. The amniocentesis was performed in mid-September. Sabine was now 6 months pregnant, and her belly could no longer be hidden. She had called in sick to school again, this time citing health problems that required a longer break. The neighbors began to talk. Mrs. Baumann had seen Sabine several times with a clearly rounded belly and told others about it. In a small town like Regensburg, such things did not remain secret for long. People wondered who the father was. why Sabine was keeping it a secret, and why S0n seemed so different. The results of the amniocentesis came back in early October. Dr. Lehmann called Sabine personally and asked her to come to the clinic as soon as possible. When Sabine and S0n sat in her office, the doctor presented a detailed report. The genetic analysis had revealed multiple chromosomal abnormalities typical of children from incestuous relationships. The probability that the parents were directly related was over 90%. Dr. Lehmann looked at Sabine intently. "I am obliged to point out to you that such circumstances may be reportable in Germany. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Sabine burst into tears. S0n turned pale as a ghost and fled the room. Dr. Lehmann let Sabine cry and then handed her a tissue. When Sabine had composed herself somewhat, the doctor continued. The child would almost certainly have serious health problems. The heart defects would require immediate surgery after birth, and even then, the chances of survival would be limited. In addition to physical deformities, there was also a high risk of cognitive impairments. She had to understand that this child could have a life full of suffering ahead of it. Sabine listened, but she had already made too many decisions that had turned out to be wrong. She couldn't give up on the child now. It was too late for an abortion, and she would have to live with the consequences. During the last months of the pregnancy, Sabine and S0n withdrew completely. They only left the house for necessary doctor's appointments. Sabine had lost weight, even though her belly was growing. Her face was gaunt and her eyes were deep set. S0n seemed like a shadow of his former self. The neighbors whispered openly. Mrs. Baumann told anyone who would listen that something was wrong with the Hoffmann family. Wild rumors circulated about the identity of the father and why Sabine was keeping her pregnancy such a secret. On January 12, 1996, the contractions began. It was a cold winter night and snow was falling on Regensburg. Sabine screamed in pain and S0n desperately called an ambulance. At the university hospital in Munich, where Sabine was already registered, they prepared for a difficult birth. The doctors had decided that a caesarean section was necessary in order not to endanger the child further. The baby was born at 3 o'clock in the morning. When the midwife lifted the newborn from Sabine's body, there was absolute silence in the operating room for a moment. The child was a girl, but the deformities were more severe than expected. Her head was noticeably small, her eyes were unusually wide apart, and she had a pronounced cleft lip and palate. Her hands showed adhesions between her fingers, and the baby's weak whimpering sounded more like a rattle. Dr. Lehmann quickly wrapped the child in a cloth and handed her to the pediatrician, who was already standing by with a ventilator. Sabine, still under anesthesia, was unaware of any of this. S0n sat in the waiting room, his hands covering his face. When a nurse came out and asked him if he wanted to see the child, he just shook his head silently. The baby was immediately transferred to the neonatal intensive care unit. The prognosis was grim. In addition to the visible deformities, the child had massive heart problems. The doctors gave her a few days, at most weeks, to live. When Sabine woke up from the anesthesia and asked about her child, she collapsed when she was told the truth. She had given birth to a child who would suffer for as long as she lived. The little girl, whom Sabine and S0n never named, survived 16 days. 16 days in which she was connected to tubes and monitors. 16 days full of operations and desperate medical interventions. The doctors in the neonatal intensive care unit fought professionally, but without much hope. The baby's heart was so severely damaged that even complex surgical procedures could only bring minimal improvement. The lungs were not working properly, the kidneys were malfunctioning, and neurological tests indicated severe brain damage. Sabine visited her child every day. She sat for hours next to the incubator, looking at the tiny creature that was connected to so many cables that you could hardly see its little body. The other mothers in the ward avoided Sabine's gaze. They had seen the deformities and didn't know what to say. A young nurse, Sister Anna, was the only one who approached Sabine with genuine compassion. She never asked about the father, never asked indiscreet questions, but simply helped Sabine hold her daughter when the medical situation allowed it. S0n came to the hospital only once to see the child. He stood in front of the incubator and stared at the little creature he had fathered with her mother. The deformities had become even more pronounced. The face looked like a cruel caricature. The skin was bluish due to lack of oxygen, and every breath seemed to be torture. S0n turned around and left without saying a word. He never returned. From that moment on, he began to drink. First in the evenings, then during the day as well. He stopped going to work and ignored his employer's concerned calls. He sat in his room, a bottle of liquor in his hand, trying to block out reality. On January 27th, a Saturday, the baby's condition deteriorated rapidly. The monitors sounded the alarm, and a team of doctors desperately tried to stabilize the little heart. Sabine stood outside the door and heard the frantic voices. After an hour, Dr. Lehmann came out, his face serious. The heart had stopped beating. They had resuscitated it for over 30 minutes, but it was too late. The child was dead. Sabine did not break down. She did not cry. She just nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for this news. Nurse Anna led her to a quiet room where she could hold her baby in her arms one last time. For the first time, without tubes, without machines, just the quiet, cold little bundle. Sabine rocked it gently and whispered an apology that no one but her could hear. The funeral took place 3 days later at the Waldfriedhof Cemetery in Regensburg. It was a grey, rainy day, and only Sabine and S0n were present. No pastor, no neighbors, no friends. They had hired an anonymous undertaker who discreetly took care of the formalities. The small urn was buried in an inconspicuous grave, without a headstone, without a name. S0n stood a few meters away, unable to come closer. Sabine knelt in the wet grass and placed a single white rose on the fresh earth. When it was all over, they walked wordlessly to their cars and drove home separately. But that wasn't the end of the story. At the clinic, Dr. Lehmann had written a detailed report on the case. The medical findings were clear, and she had an ethical and possibly legal obligation to pass on this information. She contacted the health department and reported that there was reasonable suspicion of an incestuous relationship. The authorities began to investigate. A social worker, Ms. Richter, was assigned to visit the Hoffman family and clarify the situation. In mid-February, Ms. Richter stood at the front door in Regensburg. Sabine opened the door, looking aged and emaciated. The social worker asked cautious but direct questions about the identity of the father, the living conditions, and S0n. Sabine initially tried to evade the questions, but Ms. Richter was experienced and persistent. She mentioned the medical findings, the genetic analyses, and the doctor's statements. Finally, Sabine broke down and confessed the truth. S0n was the father. It had been a terrible mistake, born of grief and loneliness. Ms. Richter carefully noted everything down. She explained that in Germany, sexual acts between direct relatives, i.e. between mother and son, were punishable under Section 176 of the Criminal Code. The public prosecutor's office would have to be informed. Sabine listened, but she no longer had the strength to fight. She accepted what was to come. When Ms. Richter left the house, she found S0n unconscious on the sofa, surrounded by empty bottles. She called an ambulance, and S0n was taken to the hospital with alcohol poisoning. The news spread like wildfire through Regensburg. Within a few days, the whole town knew what had happened in the Hoffman family. The reactions were brutal. Sabine and S0n became outcasts. Mrs. Baumann told anyone who would listen that she had always known something was wrong. Sabine's former colleagues at the school were horrified. The principal officially announced that Mrs. Hoffman would never work at their institution again. S0n lost his job without notice. His employer did not want to be associated with the scandal. The preliminary investigation began in March. Both Sabine and S0n were summoned by the police and interrogated. Both confessed to the relationship and paternity. The prosecutor, Dr. Brunner, was a strict woman in her mid-50s who showed little understanding for the circumstances. She filed charges for sexual intercourse between relatives. The psychological reports prepared during the investigation described both of them as emotionally disturbed, traumatized by Thomas's death, and unable to set clear moral boundaries. However, these reports did not change the legal situation. The trial took place in September 1996, 8 months after the baby's death. The courtroom was not open to the public, but the press had learned of the case and waited outside the building. The headlines were sensational and merciless. Mother and son, father, disabled child. Incest scandal rocks Regensburg. Taboo broken with deadly consequences. Sabine and S0n sat next to each other in the dock, unable to look at each other. The judge, Dr. Sommer, conducted the proceedings with matter-of-fact coolness. The medical evidence was presented, the confessions read out, and the psychological reports discussed. The verdict was lenient, given the circumstances. Sabine was sentenced to 1 year's probation, S0n to 9 months, also on probation. In her reasoning, the judge emphasized that both had already been severely punished by the loss of their child and social ostracism. A prison sentence would not benefit anyone. However, she also added that this was a case that showed how important psychological help was in crisis situations and how dangerous it was to cross boundaries that society had set for good reason. After the trial, Sabine and S0n left Regensburg for good. Sabine moved to northern Germany, to a small town on the coast where no one knew her. She took back her maiden name and found work as a cleaning lady in a hotel. She never spoke about her past and lived a secluded and lonely life. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the little girl with no name who had lived for only 16 days. S0n disappeared without a trace. There were rumors that he had gone to Austria, others said he had changed his name and was living somewhere in southern Germany. No one knew for sure, and no one was really looking for him. His life was ruined, and he had no future in Germany. In the year 2005, Sabine received a letter from a hospital in Innsbruck. S0n had died of liver failure, the result of years of alcohol abuse. He was 31 years old. Sabine drove to his funeral, which took place in a municipal cemetery. No one else was there. She stood at her son's grave and cried for everything that could have been, for all the wrong decisions and for the love that had gone so terribly wrong. Sabine herself died in 2014 of heart failure, alone in her small apartment in Cuxhaven. She was 77 years old. Among her personal belongings, a single photo was found showing her with Thomas and little S0n, taken in happier times. Next to it lay a yellowed white rose, carefully pressed between the pages of a book, the rose from the grave of the nameless child.